Hedrick Smith wrote the book on Russia, literally, with his bestseller, named, wait for it, The Russians, which was based on his years at the New York Times Pulitzer Prize, as the New York Times Pulitzer Prize winning bureau chief in Moscow. He also reported on the civil rights struggle. He helped publish the Pentagon Papers and reported on just about everything else in the world worth reporting on during his years at the Times, and as an Emmy-winning documentary producer for the PBS Frontline series. Most recently, has returned to the domestic scene with his book, Who Stole the American Dream?
President Carroll, Vice President Sichomka, Geraldine, but most of all, Gigi, thank you for inviting me here. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be here to talk about the values and the craft that you represent so well. David took a moment at the beginning of his talk to try to understand what it is that makes a great foreign correspondent. Unquestionably, it takes driving curiosity. You simply have to know what's going on over the mountain somewhere else. Secondly, you have to go see for yourself. You're not satisfied with getting somebody else's version of what's going on. You need to see it for yourself. You need to go talk to Khomeini or Fidel or Gorbachev or whoever it is. You need to have a spirit of adventure. You need to want to enjoy something beyond the comfortable zone that you've been living in. You do need to have courage. You need to have courage to go to places other people haven't been, or to get into situations where you're not exactly sure how you're going to get out. Never mind write a story and file a story. Just physically get in and get out. And you have to believe, as I do and as Gigi does, that getting that kind of hard, factual correspondence, that real, down-to-the-ground, shoe-leather reporting, is absolutely essential to a democracy. People in this country cannot operate. We cannot run elections. We cannot figure out what to do with ourselves, with our defense budget, with the rest of the world, with our arms, if we don't have good eyes and ears around the world. And yes, we have diplomats, and yes, we have Exxon and lots of multinational corporations, but they're there for their own self-interest. We need people out there who are simply dedicated to trying to understand what's going on the other side of the world, how those people feel, how they think, how their societies operate, and then not just reporting the breaking news, but getting under the breaking news, getting a sense of the tapestry of other societies and translating those back to our own society. So over time, not in one story or two stories or half a dozen stories, but so that over time, people at home can form a picture that's reasonably accurate about what's going on there. And the great thing about Gigi is she did that for decade after decade after decade. She did it in one part of the world and another part of the world and another part of the world. I've worked in Southeast Asia, I've worked in the Middle East, I've worked in Moscow, I've worked in Europe, I've worked in Latin America. But I guarantee you, Gigi's worked in 2 or 3 other continents that I haven't even been to. I just want to take my hat off to her. This is a great reporter. This is a great tradition. This is a great skill and a great integrity to honor. Let's give her another round of applause. In my days as a foreign correspondent, Moscow was the Everest. The Soviet Union was the Everest. It was the toughest mountain to climb. It was the highest one out there. And anybody who did mountain climbing eventually wanted to go tackle Russia. You may or may not remember that Winston Churchill once said that Russia was a puzzle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. So tonight I'm going to talk to you a little bit about, I didn't use the word riddle. He said it was a riddle inside a mystery, inside an enigma. Today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about unraveling the riddle. I want to talk about 3 different periods of reporting in Russia, 2 of which I've actually lived through. The third I'm watching. The first was the Cold War period of Russian reporting back in the early 70s when I was there. The second was the unbelievable period of perestroika in the late 80s and early 90s when I was there. And the third period is the Putin era when I was here now, and looking at it from not there but here. When I flew into Moscow in 1971 with my wife, I knew I was going into a police state. I knew we were in the Cold War with the Russians. I knew there was hostility. I knew there was propaganda. I knew there was a secret police called the KGB. I knew life was going to be tough. But as we flew in over the city, west of the city, my wife looked down and she said, you know, there are houses here. We'd heard there were apartment blocks. There are houses. Maybe we could get a house out there in the suburbs. Well, what we were actually looking at was the leadership dachas west of the city. There was no way we were going to get there. When we got to Moscow, we were slotted. We lived in one of 3 compounds that Western foreigners lived in, diplomats and correspondents. And we were guarded 24/7 by the KGB with little military boxes outside the area where we lived. And nobody could get in there without going past the millimen, as we used to call them. My kids went to English language schools. Russians start, by the way, they have foreign language schools that start English, French, German, Chinese, you name it, Japanese. And our kids went to the Russian language school, which was about 3 or 4 blocks from where we lived. And my oldest daughter formed some friends, particularly one close friendship with a girl named Marina. And when Marina came one day to see her after school, the milliman stopped her and humiliated her, and she ran home and called up Lori, my daughter, on the phone. And I went downstairs and I blew up at the guards, and I said, "Вы очень гостеприимные люди. You're very hospitable people. How can you possibly turn away a child? This is my child's friend." So that was the first barrier. It was a physical barrier. Far more important was the psychological barrier. About 10 days after we arrived in Moscow, Duke Ellington, the great jazz band leader and composer, had one of those artistic exchange concerts in Moscow. At one of the great music halls in Moscow. And ordinary people couldn't come anywhere near tickets. This was just for the Soviet cultural elite and the diplomatic corps and so on and so forth. And when we came home from the concert, and we got tickets thanks to the embassy PIO officer, we were driving our car. The office car was a black Chevrolet Impala. In that period in Russia, there were not a lot of private cars. There were a certain number of private cars. But anybody who drove a private car, in effect, became a taxi. Russians would hail you, and Russians who had cars would make extra money by picking people up and giving them a drive to wherever they wanted to go. So as we're driving down Kutuzovsky Prospect, which is one of the big streets in Moscow, we get waved at by a bunch of young people. And I thought, why not try? I'm a brand new correspondent in Moscow. Let's give it a try. So we wheel over, and they all pile in. And there must have been 7 of them. I don't know how they all got in the back seat, but 7 of them got in the back seat. It was a bunch of young doctors and medical students, and they were celebrating a marriage between Misha and Lena. They'd just gotten married, and so they took us out, 2 miles, somewhere out in some apartment block somewhere. And then they invited us in for a drink. I'm thinking, it's impossible to penetrate this society, and here I am 10 days here, and they're inviting us in for a drink. Now, Misha was very careful and told us to park around the corner, not in front of their building. So we park around the corner, and then we walk in the building. He says, "Don't talk English." And he had some English. It was reasonable English, and I had pretty passable Russian at that point. So he said, "Don't talk English," while we go past the dejurная. It's the woman who sits down near the elevator in every Russian building at that time, and on every floor of every hotel. They're called the key ladies. But they're called dejurnas. They work. So we get by there. We go upstairs to their apartment on the 8th floor, and they proceed to pull out of their pockets a couple of bottles of vodka, which they have spirited out of the restaurant. And so they start passing the vodka around, and all kinds of juice glasses and jam glasses and one thing and another appear, and people are drinking out of everything. And they teach us how to drink vodka in Russian. When you shoot it down, you just knock it down, one shot. It's dadna, bottoms up, that's it. So they pass it around, they say, all right, you do it. My wife looks at me, she says, I'm not touching it, you do it. So I say, okay, so I knock it down, I come up coughing, and they all break out laughing. They think it's a riot, this guy doesn't know how to drink, And so they explain to me that the way you drink vodka, you always exhale before you drink. The other thing you do is you take butter or milk and you lard your stomach with it, and it doesn't hit you anywhere near as hard. So we sit there drinking until 2 or 3 in the morning, and they're passing around pickles and dark bread and that kind of stuff to put out the fire that you got. And we finish, and we have to drive home. So I say, we've got to get back in touch with you. And it's all full of friendship, and we're talking, and I think, my God, this is amazing. And Misha writes down their telephone number and says, you can get in touch with us. So we get home, and the next morning I wake up, and I think, those people were so nice. I should go get them some tickets to the Ellington concert. So I get 2 more tickets from the embassy for them for the next night or a couple of nights later, and I call them up on the phone. And I get a wrong number, I get something that's not right. I call again, and I get a woman, and I ask for Misha and Liana, and no, I got the wrong number. The Shibka, big mistake. So I try again, I get the woman again. I think, I'm not going to try again. So I drive out there. I find my way back to the apartment, and remarkably, and I go up to the 8th floor, and I knock on the door, and Leanna's there, and I explain why I'm back, and I hand her the tickets, and she is absolutely delighted that she got the tickets, and they're going to go, all that kind of stuff. And I didn't write their phone number down. Misha did. But I said, I wrote your number down wrong, I guess. And when I looked at the end of the note, she said, you've got the last digit wrong. You've got a 6, and it's a 7. So what that told me was at 2:30 in the morning, after a whole lot of liquor and celebrating, this kid had been smart enough to know to change the last digit on his telephone so that I couldn't get back in touch with him. Because a single night accidental evening with a foreigner and a foreign correspondent was okay, but a continuing relationship was not. So I learned 10 days after coming to the Soviet Union that the Iron Curtain was not a wall along the border of Austria in Eastern Europe. It was right at the end of the arms of the average Russian. So the challenge then was how to get through, how to connect. KGB was very repressive. There were human rights activists. They would celebrate Human Rights Day on December 5th. They would come and unfurl banners for human rights on Pushkin Square. The demonstrations never lasted more than 2 minutes because the KGB was there in such force, they arrested them and had them carted away in less than 2 minutes. So there were problems like that. The press was totally controlled. We never had much opportunity to meet with Soviet officials. If we did, it was a propaganda press conference where they just wanted to announce something, some new agricultural goal that they'd reached or something they wanted to publicize. It was totally uninformative. You could not get appointments. You couldn't travel outside of Moscow more than 25 miles without permission of the Soviet Foreign Ministry, and they theoretically had to get the permission of the individual Soviet republics. I got to Armenia at one point, and I wrote some stuff about Armenian nationalism. The Armenian Orthodox Church, the Christian church there, is very strong. I'm not going to go into the details now, but somehow I got in touch with some people who told me some stuff, and I picked up some interesting information. So when I wanted to go to Kazakhstan, they finally called me in at the Soviet Foreign Ministry, and they said to me, Mr. Smith, you're not going to go to Kazakhstan. I said, why not? They said, because the foreign ministry in Kazakhstan, now think of that, this is an internal Soviet republic, the foreign ministry, technically they all had foreign ministries, but that's a joke. The foreign ministry in Kazakhstan doesn't like what you wrote about Armenia. And I said to the guy, I didn't realize the New York Times had any circulation in Kazakhstan. So there were limits on travel. However, and there were lots of territory that were closed to us. However, 40% of the Soviet Union was open to us. And I spent 4 days on a train going across Siberia and then up into the Soviet Klondike, equivalent to America's Alaska. I went down in the Caucasus. I went to the Baltic republics, everywhere. I got tailed a lot. The tail in Moscow was sometimes so obvious my kids could look out the back of the car window and spot the tail themselves. There were a few friends that I knew. I knew the deputy editor of Crocodile, the Soviet Human magazine at that point. I always met him at home. And whenever I went to his home, I parked the car 10 blocks away and walked and made sure that I wasn't followed, or I took the metro and I changed 2 or 3 metros to make sure nobody was following me to get there. His name was Zinovy Yuryev. He's going to come up again in a later segment. And so that was the problem. It was very difficult to get access. But the amazing thing was that you could do it. I knew personally Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the great writer who wrote about the Soviet Gulag. I knew personally Andrei Sakharov, the great physicist who was one of the fathers of the Soviet H-bomb and who later broke with the Soviet system because of atmospheric testing and became a human rights activist. I used to go to his home. I went to his home one night, and when I came out, the tires on my car had been slashed. So I told the guy who worked for the KGB, who I was our office driver, I said, "You guys slashed the tires, you go fix them." I left the car there. I got home another way. So I knew people like that. I knew the family of Boris Pasternak, the famous Nobel Prize-winning novelist. I knew Andrei Voznesensky, and I knew a whole bunch of other people. And what happened was, once I began to get to know people, they would pass me on to other people when I traveled to other parts of the country. The importance was trust. They needed not only to trust that you wouldn't reveal them in a purposeful way, but also not in a sloppy way. If you ever had a conversation, a really honest conversation with a Russian, you never repeated it in the hearing of another Russian, unless they were within the same family and you knew them and heard it together. So there are lots of ways in which you had to be secure. And then I began to find that there were all kinds of people who were sources. It was funny, you were talking about Voice of America. I remember once going to Bratsk, which they built a huge hydroelectric dam. Bratsk is 15,000 miles from here. It is so far into Siberia and north, you can't imagine it. I get out there, and every once in a while when I would travel, I would ask for permission to meet with various different groups. And in Bratsk, I asked to meet with a youth group, and they got me in touch with a Soviet teenage rock band. Amazing, amazing. So I go there, and they take me to this place, and these guys start playing rock, and they're singing in English. So when they finish, I start to talk to them in English, and they don't get a word. And I said, so I talked to them in Russian. How'd you find out? Well, they're listening to the Voice of America. And they knew Willis Conover, the guy who was the host of one of the shows. And they had literally mimicked the wording so well that I couldn't tell they didn't speak English. So there were things like that. I remember another occasion, I was in Uzbekistan on a tour for foreign journalists. They used to take us all on tours periodically to show off some great achievement of the Soviet system. And this was land irrigation in Uzbekistan. And a bunch of us went out. And they'd be everybody together. We'd be with Yugoslavs and Poles and French and Canadians. And that was interesting because you could often learn things from people from other countries. That was part of the adventure and the curiosity and whatnot. Anyway, we're out there and we go to this demonstration and we hear about this dam and this water project, and it's so boring and it's statistics and we can't figure it out and it's dull as hell. And then we have to go to another place about an hour and a half's drive from there. And everybody starts running for the cars that we're going to get into, and I missed. I got left in the car with a KGB babysitter. Wasn't labeled KGB. She worked for a news agency called Novosti, but we all knew that Novosti was a propaganda outfit for the KGB, and they were reporters for the KGB. So she was one of the babysitters for our group to make sure that we didn't penetrate Russian society. So I'm sitting there feeling terrible. For an hour and a half, I mean, at least you can laugh and joke and tell stories if you're with the other correspondents and something. I'm stuck here with a babysitter. And I'm looking out the window, and I see some Russian women there. And I just muttered to myself, what the hell don't Russian women comb their hair? When they put on some lipstick, when they look better? I was ticked off. And I hear this voice beside me say, do you have any idea how hard it is to get lipstick in Moscow? The babysitter. I said, no. What's it like? And she starts telling me for the next hour and a half about what it is like to be a woman in Moscow, how difficult it is to get decent clothes, how difficult it is to get decent shoes, how there is no perfume worth having. She tells me the subway stations where you need to go to see the guys with the black briefcases who have black market lipstick. I suddenly wake up and I say, Smith, everybody in Russia is a source. You just have to find the key. I had done something which triggered something in her, and she started to spill. She did exactly the opposite of what she was supposed to do. And so I began to peel together stories like that, and that, in the end, led to the book that I wrote called The Russians. Because what I understood at the time, we were 25 years, 30 years into the Cold War by that time, and Americans were not only interested in détente and the threat of nuclear war, the same way we're worried about nuclear war with North Korea today, only much worse because the Soviet arsenal was so much worse, but they were curious about Russians. What were they like as people? I remember talking to Dick McAdoo, who was the publisher of Little Brown, who said to me before I went to Moscow, he said, "Rick, will you write a book for me? Write a book for me." He says, "Tell me why they behave like Russians." So that's what's in the book, and that's what I got interested in. And that became such a wonderful adventure. And there were Jews who were emigrating to Israel, but they could tell me what funerals were like, what it was like to be in a family and argue about which television show you wanted to watch, and whether or not they trusted anybody in the leadership. There were all kinds of things. And I suddenly realized that if I stopped thinking of people as sources in certain categories, and I just opened everybody up to any potential question, till I found something that clicked and I opened up a subject that was interesting to them, they were willing to talk about, I could actually find out a lot about how that society operated. But it was not easy, and it took a lot of time. The change when I went back to Moscow in 1988, I wrote enough things about the Russians that they didn't like. I was persona non grata by the time I left in 1974. So I never tried to go back until Reagan went over for the summit meeting with Gorbachev in May 1988. And I was going over there with the thought of maybe doing a documentary about perestroika. Now, what you need to know is that at that time, the CIA was still suspicious that perestroika was a trick, that the system wasn't really changing, that the Russians were going to get back with the Chinese, and this was all a conspiracy, all a plot. I'd heard some things from some people I knew in Russia which led me to believe that it was genuine. I really didn't know, and I was curious to see. And I talked to some people about maybe doing a documentary series about perestroika. And so I went over there with a guy named Marty Smith, who's no relation to me, who was a good producer and a cameraman. And we went out to the bridge over the Moscow River, where Reagan's motorcade was going to go from the airport to the Kremlin. And Marty said, "Why don't you try talking to some people?" And I wanted to do it. I hadn't been talking Russian for 14 years. I wasn't sure how rusty my Russian was going to be. So I got out in the middle of the crowd and started talking to people about relations between America and Russia and what they thought and what they think about Reagan and people were really interested in talking when they found out that I was an American correspondent. And Marty suddenly pulls out this little camera of his, and he's real tall. He holds it up like this over the crowd. He starts filming this. I said, "Marty, put the camera They're millimen. They're gray uniforms, Interior Ministry, police all over the bridge for security purposes. We're going to get arrested before we get started." And he pays no attention to me, and the millimen start getting closer and closer. I say, "Marty, put the camera away. We're going to get killed." And the millimen make their way into the center of the thing, and I figure I'm about to get arrested. No, they want to get interviewed. They want to give us. And suddenly I say, "Oh my God, this thing is turned over. I cannot believe this one event I can see." So then I go call my friend Zinovy Yuriev on a payphone. He never met with me in public before. He suggests we meet in public. And when I meet him in public, we actually have a meal at a restaurant together. He tells me that the KGB confiscated some of those Sakharov and Solzhenitsyn and whatnot books that I had given him, which were contraband in the Soviet Union. They had confiscated them about a year before, but then when Gorbachev came in, they gave the books back to him. I said, "The KGB gave the books back to you?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "This is really different." He said, "Rick, it's totally different. It is really changing." What happened was we were there, and we went back and back and back and back for the next 2 or 3 years and made a 4-hour series inside Gorbachev's USSR. We were watching an earthquake undermine an empire. I've never had a 50-yard line seat on the history as it was happening without knowing what was going to happen like that. And not only were we like that, the Russians were like that. We used to go home to our hotel rooms at night, and the people, the dejornai and the other Russian staff on the hotel, would be glued to the television set to see what was happening. Why? Because Gorbachev was holding public meetings talking about policy issues. Was there enough food? Was there enough heat? Were the roads working right? Could you get a car? Things that nobody ever talked about in the old system. And they couldn't believe this was going on. There was a famous old story under the old system. Russians had a great sense of humor, which is one of the ways you learn things. They had an old joke about a meeting of the Central Committee of the Communist Party, and Volodya, one of the delegates, gets up and he says to the meeting of the Communist Party, we are having a terrible problem. I live out in Yaroslavl, and there's not enough meat out in Yaroslavl. There's nothing in the stores, and the heat only works in the apartment buildings, at night. It doesn't work during the daytime, and the roads are just terrible, and then nothing. Then the next day, Ivan gets up, and he says, I'm from Vladimir, and I got to tell you, in Vladimir, there's no meat, and the roads are terrible, and the heat only works half a day. And where's my friend Volodya? So all the Russians are watching the television to see if Volodya, who was there yesterday asking the question, is still there today. And he was. And they can't believe this thing is going on. And then they start holding elections. And we start meeting the candidates. And we start covering the candidates and literally going to election rallies. And then Sakharov, the physicist who had been a dissident and very prominent, he'd been banished to Gorky under the Brezhnev team and Chernenko. He's invited back from Gorky, and he's treated like a hero when he comes back to Moscow. Solzhenitsyn, who had been writing about the Gulag, who had fled to Norway and then fled to Vermont and lived in America, he's invited to come back. He comes back. I mean, the things that happened were unbelievable. Information at that point in Russia, it was like a fire hydrant. It wasn't that you couldn't get information. You got so much information, you didn't know how to process it. It was a totally opposite kind of thing. And incredible stories. We finally got, believe it or not, we made contact with people high up in the Central Committee apparatus, the apparatchiks of the Central Committee of the Communist Party. When I was in Moscow in the 70s, we walked on the other side of the street when we passed the building of the Central Committee of the Communist Party. I was now going in there, meeting people, and trying to arrange for places I could go film, and they allowed us to go to Sverdlovsk. Sverdlovsk is a closed city, and during the Cold War, it was a closed city. Nobody could go there. By the time I went there in 1989 with not a camera crew yet, we used to always go out and do our research and reporting first. I went out there with a crew. We were the first Westerners to go into that city other than a team of arms control experts that had gone in from the United States to monitor the intermediate range missile treaty between Gorbachev and Reagan. In fact, we were the only Westerners, we were only foreigners. They had no hotel. All across the Soviet Union, they used to have in-tourist hotels for foreigners. They didn't have an in-tourist hotel. They had to put us in the Communist Party Hotel, which was a terrific hotel, best hotel we'd ever stayed in. It was like staying in a Radisson. Not only that, at that time, you couldn't use a telephone internationally and get out very easily from Russia. When we wanted to make calls, it was unbelievably clear. We could call Moscow, we could call New York, and the connections were instant. We were inside, in effect, the military-industrial party complex because they had no precedent. They had no way of dealing with us. They'd suddenly opened it up. We had one experience after another like that in this time under Gorbachev. It was amazing. And this is the time, remember, Yeltsin gets up eventually on the tank. There's a counter coup. I mean, the access we had was unbelievable, and the story was unbelievable. And the coverage was probably the most exciting coverage I've ever done, and we never knew, because there was a counter coup, remember. There were people who were against Gorbachev, who put tanks in the street, tried to roll it back, got Yeltsin cornered in their White House, their Russian parliament building, and they wanted to do a counter coup and roll all this back. So we never knew whether or not this whole thing was going to work or not, but we had access to it. So that's another kind of reporting. Thrilling, exciting, challenging in many, many different ways, and particularly when you're making a documentary that's going to be on the air in a year, and you've got to be smart enough on how to figure out how to tell the story so what you're finding out today is relevant a year from now. And then the third era is Putin. And Putin, we're back to the same game. It's like reporting in a prison. You can't get access to information. You can't get the information out. Putin inherited a very vibrant and free press from Gorbachev and from Yeltsin, and he gradually put on the squeeze. He brought back what they call in Russia the Gubeshniki, KGB, GB. They call them the Gubeshniki, meaning the people from the KGB, okay? He brought a whole lot of those people. He was a colonel in the KGB himself. He brought a whole bunch of those people back. He put them into ministries. He put them in charge of things, and they gradually began to put the squeeze on the system. He stopped elections for provincial governors and started appointing the governors. He built the strength of his own party and basically took over the Duma, and he gradually took over the press. Now, you need to understand this. I want to talk a little bit about Putin and who is he and what's he about, what's he like. Putin's exercise of internal power is Stalinist. And I use that word very carefully, Stalinist. Stalin intimidated people by killing people, by sending them to Siberia. There have been any number of political assassinations under Putin that have been unresolved. We can't necessarily say all of them were done by the FSB, which is the successor to the KGB, but it certainly has those earmarks. A guy named Boris Nemtsov, who was, before Putin, the most likely successor to Yeltsin, was shot near the Moscow River a couple of years ago. People who tried to unearth corruption in the Soviet system have died. Sergei Magnitsky is one of them who was jailed and then died in jail, obviously beaten and denied adequate medical care. Listen to what I'm about to tell you. Since 1992, there have been 56 assassinations of journalists. 56 Russian journalists have died because they were trying to probe in the system. If you don't think that has put a cloud of fear over Russian journalists, and if they're not able to work, it's much harder for foreign journalists to work there. One of the great ones was a woman named Anna Politkovskaya, who was just unbelievably daring, unbelievably smart. They tried twice to get her. They poisoned her in 2004, and she survived. And then she was shot in the elevator of her apartment building about 4 years later. I forget whether it was 2008 or 2010. And that had a particularly chilling effect. She was like Nemtsov, she was a highly visible figure there. So there's been a clampdown, there's been a tightening there. It's not as if there are no sources. As in my day, there were dissidents back then. There's a guy named Navalny, Alexei Navalny. He runs an anti-corruption movement. There are certainly intellectuals, intelligentsia in the major cities, in St. Petersburg and Moscow and Vladivostok and other cities, Gorky, whatnot, where journalists can learn things. Certainly there are people in the academic world who lay low, but foreign journalists can talk to them. But my sense of it, and I haven't been there, but my sense of it is that the situation is about the same as it was when I was there during the Cold War period in terms of what people can report. Now let's just take a moment, because I have a hunch that you've got to be curious about this, because I am. What is Putin? What is he about? What is he trying to do? Who is he? What do the Russians want? Somebody asked me last night on WTTW, what's his end game? Now, what I want to do is I want to kind of try to take you with me to there and to try to see it a little bit from their side, because that's part of our job. You have to understand, for the Russians, the period since the end of the Cold War, since the fall of the Berlin Wall, has been one of constant defeat and humiliation. Remember, they used to have superpower summits with us almost every year. Whether it was Reagan and Gorbachev or whether it was Clinton and Yeltsin, there was a period there of a couple of decades where they saw themselves, if not as peers of ours, they saw themselves as the Avis to our Hertz. They might be number two, but they were up there and everybody else was down below. Now, when a country experiences that kind of power, projection in the world, to lose that is a source of terrible wounded pride. It sounds crazy, but if you think about it, prize fighters who lose, baseball teams that lose, politicians who lose. Losing is very difficult if the power meant a lot to you and you had it at one point. So Putin represents a country with terribly wounded pride. Secondly, with the end of the Cold War, we pushed the borders of NATO right up to the border of Russia. The Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, are about 150 miles from St. Petersburg. Now think about it. Think how we feel whether or not if the Russians were in Cuba. When Khrushchev tried to put missiles in Cuba, we went crazy. We had the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. That's our backyard. Russians see that area as their backyard. Putin is a new czar. Russian czars for 2 or 3 centuries, for several hundred years, have regarded that part of Eastern Europe, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, the Baltic states, as their sphere of influence. When another great power moves into your sphere of influence, it becomes an enormous grievance. You feel menaced, you feel endangered, you feel angry, you want to lash back. But you have to wait till the moment comes that's advantageous to you. Think of them as an economy. At one point, they were the second largest economy in the world. Now you have to go down, the 7th, 8th, they're probably smaller than California. I don't know. They're bigger than California, but they're way down the list now. Why? Because their big world export is oil and gas. And global oil and gas prices have been very low for a long time. So that's put a lot of economic pressure on them. And they also have been unable to compete in the world of modern technology. They can't sell their aircraft around the world. They can't sell computers or software and so forth around the world. They do some, but relatively speaking, compared to us, compared to the Germans, compared to the Japanese, compared to the Scandinavians and so forth. So that's another way in which they've taken a blow to their ego, to their national ego. So this is a guy who's the leader of a country that has a sense of threat from us, a sense of having been knocked off the pedestal. And this is a guy who was himself a KGB officer in Dresden, Germany, when the East German regime fell. He tells the story. He's actually been on Russian television telling the story of what it was like to be a KGB officer in Dresden and seeing literally from where he was, he could see a few blocks away, the East German crowds mobbing and assaulting the officers of the Stasi, the dreaded East German secret police, his counterparts. And he says he was panicked by that. He actually had to face, part of that mob actually came to the KGB offices in Dresden, and Putin personally went out and kind of faced them and persuaded them to back down and go away. So he has a visceral, personal, in my belief, is a visceral, personal fear of democracy, of crowds, and that was accentuated by the overthrow of Yanukovsky in Ukraine, who was the pro-Moscow leader that was overthrown by the crowds of pro-democracy people who set up tents, lived through, believe it or not, the winter. I forget which winter it was, but lived through the winter, had fires, and eventually forced Yanukovsky to flee to Moscow. So he's worried about whether or not he's next, and he's not about to let that happen at home. And I would say that what we're seeing today, what we saw last year in the 2016 election, is what I would call Putin's revenge. That was the name of a Frontline show that just showed in the last 2 or 3 weeks. I think it was a good title. Some things about the show I didn't like, but Putin's revenge. Putin saw in the Crimea a chance finally for the bear to come out of its cave and slash back and grab back some territory that used to be Russia's, with almost no danger whatsoever that we were going to do anything about it because it was so far away from us. We had no good military supply lines, and in the end, Crimea really didn't matter that much to us. He's a gambler. He's a brinksman. He tries, sees what the response is. If it's not tough, he tries again. He's trying to get back. He's trying to get back on the world stage. He's trying to get back to being taken seriously again. He's trying to get back. If he could, he'd recreate the Russian Empire what we last saw as the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. That's what we're up against. And what he's done is he's spotted a weakness in our system, which is a great strength in our system. And that's our democracy. That's our tradition of free opinion. That's our First Amendment. We don't believe in censorship. He's imposing more and more at home, making it harder at home. We don't believe in that. We've got a dilemma now. We've got a free press, and now we have social media. And the social media does not take responsibility for content and review in the same way that the New York Times or Voice of America or lots of traditional news outlets, and whether they're online or offline. Doesn't matter what the medium is. If they're a news organization, they take responsibility for what they put out. And social media doesn't. So we have this terrible dilemma. I mean, what did they do on Facebook? They did 80,000 posts on Facebook, and they reached 120 million people. They created phony, totally phony. We have to be careful about this word fake news. Fake news is literally fabricated. It's not just news you don't like a little bit. Or it's not news that's just inaccurate a little bit, or maybe a lot. It's news that is totally made up. They made up people, they made up names, they made up organizations, they made up whole cloth, total fabrications. And what they were doing was they were trying to set us against each other. They would do stuff that was for Black Lives Matters and against Black Lives Matters. In Texas, they literally ran out from a couple of different Facebook sites, they ran out one thing that attacked Muslims in Texas and urged people to go out and demonstrate in Houston at a certain place and time, and they sent another bunch of fake news out to the opposite people saying, Muslims, you need to go out and defend yourselves, and said that they should have a demonstration in the same place at the same time. They were literally trying to foment violence. So we have a dilemma in this country now on how we're going to deal with this, how to figure out, in an era of even greater communication than we've ever had before, how we're going to cope with an enemy who is now weaponized cyber warfare, is essentially weaponized freedom of the press and freedom of media. Now, that's a big issue if you want to get into that. I just want to come back to Gigi and reporting. In this situation that we are now in the dilemma that we face, what Gigi represents, what David's trying to do at VOA, what I'm trying to do with every fiber of my body, and lots of other good journalists are going to do, and what these two wonderful young women are going to do as they move forward into journalism, is absolutely stick to the standard of integrity, of fairness, of going and seeing for yourself, of being shoe-leather people who will not accept somebody else's version of the story but need to go check it out. This is absolutely essential. And those of us who care have to support this kind of media. The media needs support. The media needs a connection with the public that says, yes, you're doing something that's valuable. We have a generation who thinks media is for free, that all you got to do is Google something and it's up for free, not realizing that a lot of stuff on Google was generated by the Dallas Morning News or the Hartford Courant or the Indianapolis Star or whatever, and it costs money to actually do that. We're going to need to pay for the media. We're going to need to have consortia where the media gets together, nonprofit media gets together with universities and libraries. We may eventually have to think about public support of media as a utility for American democracy. I don't know if we're there yet, but we need to value, evaluate, and revalue the kind of reporting that Gigi Geyer represents. Thank you.
Gentlemen, I would like to know, based on what information you have from the newsrooms, from the editors' desks, from the reporters themselves, and from the daily production meetings, just how much of a risk is objectivity facing today, especially among the younger and the incoming journalists?
I want to be honest. I haven't been inside enough of those meetings to hear the dialogue inside. But from observation, it seems to me as though the rigor, I hate to say what I'm about to say. I feel like I'm a guy with white hair is saying, you know, back in the golden age, everything was great, okay? It wasn't. We made a lot of mistakes too. But I think that the old gatekeeper notion that you had to have two sources, that you didn't run with rumors, you didn't, and the three networks really dominated television to the point where if they didn't report it, it didn't really keep spreading. They actually had news standards that were important. I think we suffer now. I mean, we've thought we were going to gain greatly with cable news because it was going to suddenly make 80 or 100 or 7,000 channels available. And what we've discovered is they're all, you know, about an inch deep and you know, 10 miles wide, and quality news has suffered. The difficulty is, I think, news costs. People think it's free, particularly the younger generation. I mean, can you imagine the amount of time, the amount of money it cost for the Washington Post to do the stories it did on the dark prisons that were run overseas by the CIA? I mean, they had to put people on that for months. And the stuff the New York Times did, you know, on the NSA wiretapping and eavesdropping. And you can see the stories dropping now, whether they're looking into Trump's finances or they're going to go back and look at the uranium deal that supposedly was engineered through the Clinton Foundation. It's going to take a lot of work. The amount of time people are putting in trying to determine what the financial relations are between various different Russians and various different members of the Trump campaign or people who are advisors to the Trump campaign, that's enormously costly. And very few news organizations have either the discipline, the talent, or the funds to do that. And part of it is that lots of news organizations are not necessarily trying to run poor quality. They're trying to run on the cheap. And that's what you get. You get poor quality when you run on the cheap. That's number one. Number two, the 24/7 news cycle is terrible. I had a young woman working for me on documentary films, and she came to me at one point and she said she wanted to go into print journalism. Could I help connect her with a print journalistic outfit? And I said, sure. And I talked to some people, and she was excellent. I recommended her. She got hired. She wound up by going eventually to work for Politico, and she was working on their Capitol Hill staff. And she's very good, and she was working on stories. She would come in with stories that she had partially reported, which is typical, and she would tell her senior editor that she had a story she was developing, and this was the shape of it. Now, this is what happens. It isn't just Politico. This is this era we're living in. Her news editor, who was interested in getting a print story at the end of the day, was willing to let her go on and do several more hours of reporting. The guy running the online service says, I want that story now. She said, but it's only half cooked. I haven't checked it out fully. I don't care. You've got enough information that we can put that out. We want to beat the opposition. You're ahead of all of our competitors. She finally left. She was disappointed in the pressures that the 24/7 news cycle put on her as a reporter and on her editors. It has a lot to do with it. So money and time is some of it. And some of it is a sloppiness. But we always, if we're older, tend to look at younger people and say they don't do as good a job. There's some really great young reporters out there today. I want to say that.
In World War II, the United States, at great risk through Arctic convoys, sent hundreds of thousands of tanks and trucks and radio equipment to the Russians. Now, are Russians aware of this? Is it taught in the school? Is there any residual feeling of gratitude?
Yeah, certainly there are people in certain parts of Russia, they're up and around Murmansk and so forth, where there were a lot of the convoys that landed. If you talk to older people that's there, there will be other people who are certainly aware of you usually find that more in Western Russia. You find it around St. Petersburg. You might find it, in the Ukraine. But the answer is that the regime is not talking about that. The official media, the controlled media, do not make much of that. If there is a reasonably friendly relationship with an American president who comes to visit, then sometimes around those visits, some of that old, nice, warm, friendly Allied memory comes out. But the answer is, by and large, no. That World War II stuff is not known by the younger generations.
I have just two brief questions about the average Russian citizen today, you had mentioned that Putin is trying to buoy up the idea of national pride and nationalism. But beyond that, considering their daily lives, are they severely restricted, and the economy is not functioning well? So how much traction does that national pride get in the mentality of the average Russian citizen today?
I want to be careful and not leading you to believe I know more than I know. My knowledge is based on the reporting I'm reading and on the polling that I see done among Russians by Russian polling agencies, okay? The indications are, certainly there's a lot of economic dissatisfaction. The Russian economy is not in great shape. They do not have a lot of foreign currency. The sanctions that have been imposed on the West because of Russian action in Ukraine and Crimea have bitten in, and so they have an effect. Where that causes disaffection, from what I can tell, is mostly among the urban intelligentsia, reasonably well-educated people, professional people who have some knowledge of the world, who also have some aspirations to travel, and who feel the economic pinch. But I would say that for what the Russians call the narod, what the Germans call the Volk, the people, the mass, Putin has been very clever, and the Russian media have been very clever in playing on feelings of nationalism. And the Russians are much better than we are at tightening their belts. Russians have a long-time tradition and habit of sort of stiff upper lip, sort of taking it hard. And if you blame the folks on the other side for doing it, you sort of acknowledge that, yeah, we aren't doing so well, but it's those damn Westerners that are causing it. It's their blockade, it's their sanctions. And we're really helping our fraternal brothers in the Ukraine, and they really want to ally with Russia. So there's a way of casting and framing the story where it's really very effective as a propaganda story that is credible to a large majority of Russians, from what I can tell.
May I do one quick follow-up?
If it's very quick, because we have some other people who've been waiting.
Are there any inroads in improving the Russian economy, given the sanctions and everything else?
Are there any what?
Inroads being made in improving the Russian economy, like, for instance, technology. And
well, I don't want to say, I didn't want to leave the impression from my comments I made before, let me make this fast, that there is no Russian technology. Yes, there is Russian technology. They're working on aircraft, they're working on vessels, they're working on internet stuff. And they have some very, very bright cybernetic scientists, obviously. I mean, if you look at what they're able to do in our internet, obviously they got some very capable people there. So yes, there are efforts to be made there. I was just trying to compare them to the leading economies in the world and their ability to compete. Can I ask a question, David, as a reporter? On this last trip of the president's, did VOA report that President Trump said he asked President Putin about the interference by the Russians in our election, and Putin said they didn't interfere, and he sort of trusted Putin's sincerity on that issue, and then he rode back. But we have the intelligence agencies say, including the chiefs appointed by Trump, that in fact they did interfere. So what does VOA report to the world out of that mess?
We reported pretty much exactly the same way the other major media reported. We reported what he said, we reported what others have said, reported what the intelligence services have said, and I would say you wouldn't find any difference between our coverage than what you saw on the networks or the major news.
So my name is Sabrina Henderson. I am a student at Dominican, of course, and I'm in Professor Jenks' class on news media writing. Today we were talking about the dangers of being a foreign, I just forgot the word, correspondent, and being in life-threatening situations. And we were talking about freelancers versus people who work with New York Times and Washington Post. So my question is, how do you know when to follow the news source, even if it costs your life? Is there a stop? Is there a point where you have to back up? Yeah.
Yeah, I can tell you that at one point when I was running the Washington Bureau of the New York Times and working very closely with the foreign editor, I got a call from one of our correspondents in the Middle East. This is some time ago. This is when Beirut was blowing up. The guy's name was John Kiffner, a famous, very, very good reporter. And Kiffner had been in Beirut, and there were car bombs going off all over the place, very unpredictably. So this is not sort of, do I decide to take a risk to go to X, Y, or Z? I'm the Beirut correspondent of the New York Times, and the stuff is blowing up all around me. And so every once in a while, as the foreign editor or somebody like that, you say to a guy like Kiffner, get the hell out of Beirut, go over to Cyprus and take a few days off. And somebody had said that to Kiffner. Kiffner called me, was looking for the foreign editor. And we couldn't find the foreign editor, and Kiffner had worked for me when I was helping to run the national desk. And so I talked to him, and I knew him fairly well, and I knew him to be an extremely brave correspondent, and not anybody would flinch from anything. And my sense was that Kiffner was unusually afraid for Kiffner. So my judgment as not his direct boss, but I stepped in for his direct boss, and I said, Kiff, take another 2 or 3 days in Cyprus and call Bernie Gewirtzman, who was then the foreign editor. And if somebody wants to blame anybody, have them blame me. But you need to get your feet kind of back underneath you. And I think that there is no way of kind of quantifying that. I don't think, you know, I've been in battle, I've been shot at because I was with troops that were being shot at. It's very scary. And most of the time when you do that, you sort of figure you're going to go in and come out all right. I mean, if you look at something and you think, this is a squad of 7 people and they're going up in a hill that are held by 200 people, you say, I think I'm going to cover this from down at the bottom of the hill. You really, it's not fair for a news organization to ask people, to take extraordinary risks. The line is sometimes not very clear, but there are times when the line, is reasonably clear, and you can say, I mean, for example, if the Russians are bombarding, a Syrian city, and you're coming in from Turkey, and you've got a chance to get there, and you know the bombardment is going on, it's unpredictable. You maybe just slow and wait until the bombardment eases, and then you go in and try to cover after it's stopped, if you can do that. I think you have to make reasonable calculations. After all, you're not serving your news organization. I mean, number one, you should be protecting your life. But number two, you're not serving your news organization. If you go in and get killed, they don't get a story out of your death, and they certainly don't want your death. So, I mean, I think people have to be prudent. The really difficult ones are when you're in some part of Afghanistan, you're going to another part of Afghanistan, and you know there are roadblocks on the way, and people have been getting through those roadblocks, but every once in a while they haul people out of a car and they shoot them. Do you go or don't you go? Well, you pay attention to what's happened in the last 2 or 3 weeks or the last 2 or 3 days, and then you try to make a sensible human judgment.
Again, I'd like to thank Dominican University for undertaking this wonderful initiative. This is the second time I've attended, and it's very, very impressive. And then, given that there are journalist students here, I would like to inquire what your advice to students would be about how to enter the profession of being a professional journalist and a foreign correspondent.
The first thing I would say is get any opportunity you can to do reporting, writing for some media. The 2 young ladies who are going to Spain were talking to us earlier this evening, and they were talking about sending reports back from Spain. I said, whatever you do, if you're going to put it in the college paper, university paper, put it in the university paper. If you can hook up with local suburban newspapers, if you can hook up with the Chicago Tribune, get the practice, do it. Don't worry about what level it's at, just do it. One of the most important things somebody said to me when I was back at that stage was, if you get a chance to write 20 stories a year or 200 stories a year, write 200. Affiliating with some news organization and then looking at a news organization the same way you would look at the faculty of a university. How good are they? How demanding is the editor going to be? Is this a teacher I want to learn from? Because your editors are your teachers in the same way that the faculty are. Is this somebody who feeds my curiosity, who challenges my abilities, who encourages me when I do well, and who shows me a better model? But there's just no substitute for doing it. I mean, and you can write book reviews, you can write humor, you can go abroad and write some stuff back. If you take trips, learn how to write a travel log, write it for your family, but best of all, if you can, get it published, get it used, get it somewhere where some professional has said, this is good enough for us to use, because that's a testimonial to your ability, and it's something you can use as a reference to the next person you want to go to work for.
Thanks, Dr. Jenks. So as he said, I'm a recent alum of Dominican University, and I graduated from Dr. Jenks' journalism program, and I am recently working in Chicago for a healthcare publishing company. And I just wanted to ask you both about a certain topic that you touched on really heavily during this lecture, which was great, by the way. I enjoyed it, and last year's as well. The topic I wanted to ask you both about was trust, and trust between a reporter and their audience, and trust between, I guess, just news organizations in general. Growing up, I have been able to see, I guess not, the word fortunate wouldn't be the correct word, but I've been able to see the emergence of technology and how social media has played not only such a big part in people's personal lives, but professional lives as well. And I'm gonna read this question from my phone because I just wanna make sure I get it right. But in your opinion, in educating this future generation of journalists, how do we go about reinstating that trust between our young generation that's coming in right now, and with the media, and with social media coming from so many angles, and with an administration that is doing all in its power to either degrade the news or give us only certain bits of information? How do we reinstate that trust with our younger people in the news media?
My suspicion is that the way that question would be posed in a different social setting would be quite different. Trust is the gold of the realm. There's no question about it. And part of what's happened now in the division in America today is a result of the fact that we in the mainstream media have lost the trust of a very large body of Americans, particularly the Americans who've been left out and left behind in our economy. We have reported and repeated endlessly the beliefs and the analysis of the economic elite, which is basically global trade is good for America, and we're all going to benefit by it. And we now have 40%, maybe more, of our population that has had a different life experience. Part of our problem is we haven't done what Gigi did. We didn't go out to rural Wisconsin and rural Indiana and North Dakota and other places and discover that there really was a big chunk of America that was left behind. And it's difficult for us to regain the trust of those people now. I think among the audiences like the one we have here tonight, the major mainstream media have pretty good trust. They lost it early in 2016, partly because they ridiculed Donald Trump. They didn't take him seriously, and the polls showed most people that Trump wasn't going to win, and lo and behold, he won. And so people were shocked, and they distrusted the media. I mean, I just saw somebody write an op-ed or a letter to the editor in the Washington Post the other day saying, you know, the media was wrong on Trump versus Clinton, and the media was wrong in the Virginia governor's race, so why should I trust the media again? So I think we're up against a very, very large hurdle with a very substantial portion of our population, and it is fueling this polarization within our political system. Part of the difficulty is that we've got a lot of practitioners in the media who believe that the best way to build their audience and to get eyeballs and clicks, which means income, is conflict. And what we're going to do is we're going to report the polarized extremes of conflict, and that's going to attract people. And in fact, you know, that works pretty well. The difficulty is that most realities are complicated. They take a while to explain. They fall between the extremes, and lots of impatient people who want quick answers give up. And it's very hard for us to work at that and to reach those people. We build our audiences, we don't try to select the audiences, but we do select them by the way we work. There was a movement back in the 90s called public journalism. And what it was a bunch of journalists who felt that we had lost touch with our public. And we were reporting politics, for example, from the standpoint of political campaigns, the candidates, the strategists, the news shows, and not from the standpoint of the voters. That we were reporting economic news from the standpoint of corporate quarterly reports and Wall Street performance, not the job experiences of average people. I think those were valid criticisms. And what those of us who were involved in that movement were trying to do was to say, we need to reorient. And particularly, for example, on the campaigns, we need to go out and find out what the people think the issues are, not what the candidates think the issues are, and begin to hold the candidates responsible. I think we have to work hard at integrity, at honesty, at telling both or multiple sides of the story. But we also have to look to reach for opinions that fall without our own, outside of our own comfort zones. That's hard to do. It's easier to say. It's much harder to do, particularly if you're under time pressure and you don't have enough money. It's work. It's going to be your job, and I bet you figure it out.
All right.